Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 53, The History of Denmark. So today's drink of choice is Danish mulled mead. Mulled mead, or wine, for those of you who don't know, is wine or mead that is heated up with some spices like cinnamon or allspice and traditionally served around Christmas or the winter months. Wine/mead has been created in Denmark since roughly the 1500s, although possibly earlier. In terms of the alcoholic drink of choice, Danes are more likely to have beer or spirits rather than wine/mead, but mulled drinks are viewed, at the very least in the States, as a bit more exotic and marketable, so it was easier for me to find this than beer or liquor. I got 2 bottles of Dansk Mule, which sells a variety of Danish meads that recommend on the back heating them up or serving them at room temperature or keeping them cold as a aperitif. They present themselves with a Viking longboat on the front and often mentions their recipes are based off of old historical recipes. This is something common for Danish or just Scandinavian products, often harkening back to a romanticized Viking past. Overall, the mead I felt was fine. I like the mead with hibiscus just because I love hibiscus, but honestly, if I'm having mulled wine, I prefer it to be homemade by myself. Still, since we are going into the colder months, if you want something to put you in a holiday mood, this works well in achieving that. But let's start talking about Denmark. The Kingdom of Denmark is located in northern Europe, with Germany south of it, the Atlantic Ocean and North Sea west of it, the Skagerrak and Kattegat Seas north of it, and the Baltic Sea east of it. The capital of the country, Copenhagen, also is connected via bridge to the Swedish city of Malmö. It's also important to remember Denmark is greater than just Denmark proper. There are 2 autonomous territories located in the North Atlantic controlled by Denmark, Greenland and the Faroe Islands. These 2 territories, mostly Greenland, shoot Denmark from the 130th largest country in the world to the 12th largest, although with only a little over 100,000 people living in both territories combined. These 2 territories are, for the most part, going to be ignored this episode, largely to prevent the episode from just getting too sidetracked, but they are important to mention because they geopolitically play an important role in the country today, and are important reminders that Denmark has historically always been a country with colonies or far-flung territories that will be mentioned throughout the episode. Denmark is like a lot of Northern Europe, cold. But luckily for Denmark, it's a little bit warmer than its northern neighbors of Norway and Sweden, serving as a transitional region between northern and western/central Europe, both climatologically and even historically. It's a broadly flat and temperate country. Denmark has a little over 6 million people living in it. The majority of people are ethnically Danish, with the estimates I've seen suggesting something like over 85% of the country is ethnically Danish. Within the country, there are several minority groups that are often divided between traditional minorities that often have ties to the country going back centuries, and new minorities, whose community ties are much more recent, although it often depends on the community and individuals themselves. Traditional minorities include groups like the Germans, largely located in northern Schleswig along the German border, and the Jewish, Greenlandic, and Faroese communities, found largely in Copenhagen and other major urban centers. New minorities include Arabs, Poles, Romanians, Turks, Kurds, and many others, mostly from other parts of Europe and the Middle East, but also from all over the world. These groups range from barely breaking 1,000 members to over 100,000 members. Language-wise, almost the entire country will speak Danish, with it being the language of mass media, education, politics, business, and just everyday life. Danish is a North Germanic language closely related to Norwegian and Swedish. It also does have some similarities to Faroese, and even some similarities to German and English. These 3 languages are all spoken in Denmark, with Faroese and Greenlandic spoken by roughly 20,000 people living in Denmark each, German given limited legal recognition in some border communities, and English being an extremely common second language, with over 80% of Danes able to understand it. Other common second or first languages include French, Swedish, Arabic, and Polish. Religion-wise, Denmark is majority Christian, with the Church of Denmark actually being the official state religion, although freedom of religion is present. Demographics tend to show a majority of Danes, going as high as 75%, are members of the church. However, many people are rainy day Christians, only going to church on special occasions, and it's serving somewhat as more of a cultural symbol than anything else. Within the church, there are several different movements and organizations trying to influence the church and push it towards their own direction of correct Danish worship, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Other Christian groups like Catholics, Baptists, Reformed, Orthodox, and Mormons are also present, making up a little less than 2% of the population. There are several other religious groups present, most prominent being Islam, with roughly 5% of the population being Muslim, mostly being those from an immigrant background and largely found in Denmark's major cities. There also are Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, and neo-pagans. Finally, a significant chunk of Denmark is irreligious, with as low as 10% to as high as 25% holding no real religious beliefs. I would also like to real briefly thank my patrons. I recently just got a new one, so thank you to Andy Marrow. I appreciate it. I'll also thank my Uncle Rodden, who gave me a very kind donation via PayPal. I'm glad you liked the Czech history episode, and I'm glad the political parties episodes haven't driven you mad yet. And then finally, before I begin, I want to take a second and talk about some of the sources I used to make this episode. Because this is a podcast, I'll recommend another, the Scandinavian History Podcast written by Michael Shankman. It's, as the name suggests, a history of Scandinavia, very much in the same vein as the History of Rome podcast. Since he is talking about more than just Denmark, honestly most episodes seemingly are about Sweden, I didn't listen to every single episode, but I've listened to roughly 2/3 of them, and I enjoy it. If after this episode you want to learn more about Scandinavia, I'll encourage you give him a listen. He's just gotten to the 1800s, so there's plenty more to expect in the future. I also read 2 books in preparation for this episode. The first book I read was The History of Denmark by Knud J.V. Jespersen. It's not actually a full history of Denmark, only focusing on modern Danish history, starting after the end of the Kalmar Union. It's similar to if you go back to my Colombia episode, Colombia, A Concise Contemporary History, where each chapter traces a single thread in Danish history over the years, and seemingly how that one specific thread develops. So it goes over Denmark's role on the world stage, the development of democracy, economic changes, and the church. It was written in 2004, so there are about 20 years missing, which I would argue particularly colors some of the analysis done at the end of the book, but still it was an interesting read, and if you are curious on modern Danish history, I think it's a pretty good read. Finally, there is A Church History of Denmark by Martin Schwarz-Lausten. It's a look at the development of Danish Christianity and religion more broadly. While I typically don't talk about church history, and it's something I can confess I'm not as well versed on, it still was pretty interesting. Many political movements in the country have seen some significant influence from Christian movements, theologians, and academics, so it's useful in getting a more intellectual background on some of these movements. That being said, at times it does feel like it's just mentioning figures and what they wrote or what titles they had, and then not really connecting them or explaining the significance. If you are interested in the history of Christianity or the development of the Church of Denmark, I'd encourage you check it out. So with that out of the way, let's start talking about Danish history. Sometime roughly around 12,000 BCE, glaciers that previously covered much of Scandinavia began retreating back north. Humans began slowly pushing north, with many settling in Denmark. Denmark, as stated earlier, was both warmer and connected with the rest of the European mainland via Germany, and not from the frozen oblasts of Russia's northwest like Norway and Finland. This meant that for many centuries, Denmark had a larger population than both Norway and Sweden, often larger than both combined. This gave Denmark a significant advantage, as we will talk about later. Germanic peoples began settling in Denmark roughly around the 500s BCE, bringing with them iron tools and continuing the agricultural practices of earlier settlers. When these Germanic settlers became Danish is unclear, but in the early centuries of the first millennium, it's likely a Danish or at least Norse culture started to form. This Norse culture had a stratified society of the Jarls at the top, free peasants below them, and then thralls and slaves below both. There is some speculation around the role of women in Norse society, with some suggesting that women were given a significant chunk of autonomy and or decision-making power. We do know that Norse paganism was based around Germanic paganism, with gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya being particularly popular gods to worship. Sacrifice, including of humans, was believed to be semi-common, and it's theorized that religion was without a priest class and was much more horizontal in nature. The economy of Denmark was at the time largely agricultural, and as the centuries went on and the Middle Ages progressed, trade became more and more common, with the Danish town of Hedeby serving as an important port on the Baltic Sea. Hedeby would also be an important center for Viking raids. Now, the term Viking is believed to mean raider and actually was reserved for just those Norsemen who traveled plundering throughout Europe. If you were a Danish farmer, you weren't really a Viking, just a Dane. Regardless, these Vikings would prove a menace to much of Europe. Danish Vikings would play an important role raiding England, Ireland, the Baltics, France, and Germany. Danish Vikings, along with their families, would settle across northern Europe, helping establish the first Norse settlements in the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. While initially these territories were more closely related to Norway than Denmark, they were a part of the wider Norse culture. Slowly in Denmark, the country was transitioning from local lords and chieftains to a single kingdom. the Kingdom of Denmark. When it exactly formed and by whom is unclear. Much of early and Viking Age Norse history ranges from murky to largely guesswork. Maybe one of the most famous Danish kings was Ragnar Lothbrok, who led many daring raids across the Viking world, and the TV show's Vikings is based around. The first official king would be Grom the Old in the mid-900s, who, according to legends, built the Danevirke, a legendary fortification separating Denmark from Germany, located in what is now the German state of Schleswig-Holstein. This also brings up an important aspect of Denmark's geography. Historically, Denmark was larger than just the current Danish borders of Denmark proper. Schleswig would for many years be an important part of the Danish kingdom, with the town of Hedeby, I mentioned earlier, actually located in the region, and the Kingdom of Denmark was often simultaneously the Duke of Schleswig. Skipping ahead, the Duchy of Holstein, just south of Schleswig, would be in a personal union with Denmark starting in the late 1400s. Both Schleswig and Holstein would both contribute fighting men, taxes, and resources to the Danish crown, but also give Denmark a substantial German minority. The other important Danish territory to mention would be Scania, located in what is now southern Sweden. This would be extremely useful, as it meant Denmark controlled both sides of the entrance to the Baltic Sea. This would for years be considered a core part of the Danish kingdom, inhabited by a largely Danish-speaking population. Scania, and later the German duchies, would be a vital part of the Danish kingdom, serving as an important source of manpower, resources, and national pride. Slowly, Christianity began to creep into the kingdom. Initially, missionaries sent to Denmark struggled to find converts. A small Christian population did slowly begin to arise, partially due to Christian slaves taken from raids creating the first congregations in Denmark, along with a small number of those who had converted. Most likely, these initial converts would be traders who converted to gain favor with their Christian clients they traded with. The first king to convert would be Grom the Old's son, Harald Bluetooth, converting, according to legend, after seeing a Christian missionary holding burning iron without any injuries. A less fantastic reason for Harald's conversion could be the increasing influence Christian kingdoms like England and the Holy Roman Empire was having on Danish politics. And in order to fit into this new European order, much of the establishment converted. Regardless, by the 900s, Denmark was moving steadily in the direction of Christianity, and while there would be resistance at times, eventually Norse paganism would be fully replaced with Christianity. Importantly, in the late 1000s, the Archbishopric of Denmark would be established, showing both that Christianity was firmly established in Denmark by this time, and the kingdom was powerful enough to lobby for its own autonomous archbishopric. Another sign of Danish strength would be in its overseas territories. Perhaps the height of Danish power in Europe would come in 1028, when Canute the Great was self-proclaimed King of Denmark, England, and Norway by conquering England and Norway. His empire, the North Sea Empire, as historians would later describe it, wouldn't last long after his death, but it did show Denmark was able to play a major role in northern European politics. While Norway and Denmark broke apart shortly after Canute's death, Denmark and Norway continued to be closely linked throughout the Middle Ages, with Denmark sometimes controlling Norway, Norway sometimes controlling Denmark, and trading links established between the two. Denmark would control several duchies and states along the Baltic Sea, including the Duchy of Estonia, established in 1219 in the midst of the Livonian Crusades, as the Danes and other European Christian crusaders sought to Christianize the Baltics. Danish Estonia would last until the mid-1300s, but it would be re-established in the mid-1500s, where it would last another century before being lost to Sweden. Going into the late 1300s, Denmark increasingly found themselves in competition with the Hanseatic League, a coalition of several German cities in northern Germany, along the Baltic Sea. In the 1360s, Denmark and the League went to war, and in the aftermath of this war, the Danes looked to their Scandinavian neighbors of Norway and Sweden for allies. In 1363, Margaret of Denmark married the King of Norway and Sweden, with both kingdoms currently in a personal union. By 1397, Margaret had managed to work her way into becoming the head of all three kingdoms, and that year, in the Swedish city of Kalmar, proclaimed her nephew, Eric, as the king of all three kingdoms, leading to the start of the Kalmar Union. While each kingdom was technically separate, the monarchy was often based in Copenhagen, and the majority of the population was found in the Danish kingdom. This made Denmark de facto the head of the union. It's worth taking a second and pausing to discuss the Danish economic and political situation. The Danish economy had for thousands of years been largely agricultural, with the majority of the country farmers and products like wheat, grain, dairy, and beef being the main exports out of Denmark. Most farming was subsistence-based, with only a limited amount actually exported, and most farms in a collectivist model and tied to manors and villages. While there was a limited metallurgy, fishing, and mining market along with Danish traders connecting far-off products from the North Atlantic to Europe, these industries were marginal in the grand scheme of things. Instead, the biggest revenue for Denmark would be the sound dues. Since Denmark occupied both sides of the entrance to the Baltic Sea, any foreign ship coming to or out of the sea would have to pay a fee to the Danish state. This ended up being the biggest revenue for the state by far, allowing for the construction of many castles throughout the Danish kingdom, and importantly, funded mercenaries which increasingly made up the bulk of the Danish army. This, somewhat unforeseen, ended up undermining the nobility of Denmark. The nobility, along with the priest of the Catholic Church, served as either confidants, advising the king, or rivals, threatening the king's political power, and even sometimes serving as both. The priests were able to maintain their influence through spiritual wisdom and their connection with Rome, while the nobles maintained their influence by raising men to fight for the Danish king, which slowly, as the centuries went on, was being replaced by mercenaries. These mercenary armies would be put to work throughout the Kalmar Union. Fighting was sometimes against the Hanseatic League, but also increasingly against revolts and revolutions throughout the Union. Looking at Wikipedia, it lists the Kalmar Union as existing between 1397 to 1524. However, in reality, the Union was de facto dissolved at several points, as massive wide-scale revolts broke out throughout the Union. Increasingly, Sweden became the main rival to Denmark in the Union, as both were the two largest players, with Norway serving more on the sidelines. The wars between the Danish heads of the Union and the Swedish rebels finally culminated in the Swedish War of Liberation in 1521. It would end 2 years later with Sweden breaking away, although Denmark did remain in control of Scania and kept Norway in a personal union. The next roughly 3 centuries would see the state of Denmark-Norway under the rule of the Oldenburgs, a German noble family that took the Danish throne in the 1400s. Shortly after the Kalmar Union broke away, Denmark-Norway would have to deal with another rebellion, the Counts' War. As the Protestant Reformation began to sweep Europe in the early 1500s, Denmark quickly saw a rise in Protestant sentiment. This was especially true in the German-majority territories of Schleswig and Holstein, where Lutheranism became the majority denomination. Slowly, Danish nobles, and even members of the royal family, began aligning with the Protestants. In 1534, tension boiled over as the Catholics sought to bring back the deposed Christian II, while the Protestants fought to defend the current king, Christian III. 2 years later, the Protestants would emerge victorious, bringing about Protestant reforms in the Danish church. Bishops' salaries were greatly reduced, Lutheran theology and worship replaced Catholic practices, students studying abroad was discouraged for fear that they would return with Catholic sympathies, a quasi-welfare state slowly started to be established, and importantly, the king became a religious figure, as the princely church was established. As the head of the church, church land became royal land, making the king the country's largest landowner. It also made the priests who played an important role in medieval Danish politics politically obsolete, as now the king and the nobles were all that remained, since the Danish archbishop was dissolved, and the bishops had to follow the king's command, at least theoretically. The idea of the crown of Denmark became a very important thing to protect and strengthen, which ended up leading to the Danish state to grow increasingly more and more powerful. Denmark-Norway also saw a growth in Danish colonies overseas. The northern Atlantic territories Norway used to control, like Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, all fell under Danish control in the aftermath of the Kalmar Union's collapse, an indication of Danish dominance over the kingdom. However, the bigger colonial growth would be outside of Europe. In the early 1600s, the Danish East India Company was set up, establishing several trading posts in India, tried to set up a larger colony in the southern Nicobar Islands, and was headquartered in Tharumgampati in southern India. It largely was established to help build trading links between South and East Asia. The other colonial projects were established by the Danish West India Company in the late 1600s. They established several forts along the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, where they would buy African slaves in exchange for European firearms and goods, and would ship them to the Danish West Indies, now the modern-day U.S. Virgin Islands, where they would be forced to work on plantations harvesting sugar and rum. The Atlantic Triangle trade and Danish India helped provide Denmark with more exotic goods, helping make the Danish kings and merchants even richer, and help shows just how powerful Denmark was in the early modern period. Denmark would have to be powerful, as it frequently went to war against its new main rival, Sweden. With the decline of the Hanseatic League, the two new powerful Baltic players would be Denmark and Sweden, who frequently came into conflict over the dominance of the sea. Initially, Denmark was the stronger contender in the conflict, defeating Sweden in the Kalmar War in 1613, due to heavy use of experienced mercenaries. This saw an overly confident Christian IV decide to lead Denmark into the 30 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire. Christian, also a German duke, wanted to both expand his territory further south into Germany and to win fame as the defender of Protestantism as the Lion of the North. However, Danish involvement in the war ended in disaster, as imperial forces were led by the highly capable military commander Albrecht von Wallstein, and eventually Schleswig-Holstein and Jutland were occupied by imperial forces, forcing Denmark to sue for peace. Sweden would also later join the 30 Years' War and, unlike Denmark, was highly successful. In the 1640s, Denmark and Sweden would go to war, and Denmark lost fairly decisively. From this point onward, Sweden was the dominant contender in dominance over the Baltics. In the 1650s, Sweden would almost end up completely invading and annexing Denmark, with a joint Danish-Dutch defense just beating back the Swedes in a siege of Copenhagen. Still, Denmark was greatly weakened, forced to cede several border territories along the Norway-Sweden border, and importantly, gave Sweden control over Scania. The loss of Scania greatly weakened Denmark's position for two main reasons. Firstly, it gave the Swedes access to the Atlantic Ocean, allowing them, and by extension, other foreign merchants a way to bypass the Sound dues. It also removed the Scanian buffer from the capital Copenhagen, making the city more exposed and easier to attack. In the aftermath of the loss of Scania, Denmark saw a radical political transformation. A great meeting was called by Frederick III in 1660, where the nobility, clergy, and high-ranking commoners would meet in Copenhagen. While the nobles wanted to retain most of their historic privileges and keep the status quo, Frederick was very popular, having led the defense of Copenhagen from the Swedish siege, and the nobles' claims to influence, their ability to raise armies, had long been outdated by the use of mercenaries. After Frederick ordered troops into Copenhagen, the nobles were forced to relent. Frederick based the new Danish state on absolutist ideals. The nobility's privileges were largely abolished, the first ministries were created, and eventually a full legal code, land reform, and freedom of religion was established, although with the Danish church still as a national church. Commoners were given the opportunity to move up politically and socially, with even many ministries being headed by those of non-noble birth, theoretically based on just the competence of the commoner. Although loyalty to the king and remaining in his good graces was in many ways more important than knowledge or competence, and social differences between rich and poor did widen. The Danish king's wealth was expanded, and he was looked on as responsive to the people. The 1700s saw continued reform at home and challenges internationally. Further reform saw mandated confirmation at 14, which required a limited education set up in 1736, building the stage for universal education in the early 1800s. New agrarian reform in the mid-1700s led to the privatization and isolation of the Danish countryside, with isolated farmsteads becoming the norm rather than the previous collectivist model of the past. In the church, Pietist reformers encouraged individual spiritual transformation rather than allegiance to the organization of the church. Jespersen argues this, and particularly rural Pietist-inspired revival movements in the 1800s may have been a call for a return to the previous collectivist model of other decades. Denmark did grow rich due to their colonies, although in wars with Sweden they suffered. While they did with Russia and Saxony beat Sweden in the Great Northern War, it started with the Swedes landing in Zealand and coming close to taking Copenhagen, and Denmark really only won the war due to help from their allies. With the exception of a war at the end of the 1700s, Denmark largely remained neutral and became an important trading player in Europe. This was ended in the Napoleonic Wars, as Britain distrusted neutral Denmark and attacked Copenhagen in both 1801 and 1807, devastating the Danish fleet, leading Denmark into siding with France. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars, as punishment for siding with the French, Denmark-Norway was forced to dissolve, with Sweden given Norway. Denmark in 1850 would be given the small German duchy of Lauenburg as compensation. Denmark in the 1800s would become racked by internal dissent, as slowly cracks in absolutism began to dawn. In the church, more Danes turned to either Pietist revival movements, new denominations like baptism, or just left the church altogether. The Danish state didn't have to worry about liberal revolutions threatening the state in the 1700s, as the Danish monarchy was both well-liked and considered responsive to the people. But the 1800s saw this slowly beginning to change, as a growing liberal cadre started to emerge. The liberal movement was particularly strong in the German parts of Denmark. By 1850, Denmark was largely divided between two ethnic groups: the Danes, who made up 2/3 of the country, and the Germans in Schleswig-Holstein, who now, with the loss of Scania and Norway, made up 1/3 of the country, and with Schleswig and Holstein one of the more richer areas of the kingdom. These Germans were inspired by other nationalist and liberal movements throughout Germany that called for a pan-German state to emerge, and slowly they began demanding independence. In 1848, the springtime of the people saw liberal reform in Denmark. That year, Danish King Christian VIII died, and the new king, Frederick VII, had only 2 months before Danish liberals marched on Copenhagen, demanding greater democracy and an end to absolutism. This they were able to achieve, along with the removal of several conservative ministers, separation of powers, and male suffrage. However, controversially, they also called for Denmark to fully absorb the German duchies it controlled into a single state, ending the outdated aristocratic distinction between the two. However, the Germans living in Schleswig-Holstein feared this would entail Danish domination over them. In response, Germans living in the territory went into revolt, aided by other German states like Prussia and Saxony. Denmark was able to defeat the rebelling Germans, although without fully incorporating the duchies into Denmark proper. This victory would result in overconfidence among the Danes, believing they could easily crush any future war against the German nationalist. What Denmark had failed to realize was that by the 1700s, Denmark was fast becoming a third-rate power. While the Danish military had seen reforms going into the 1800s that helped modernize the military, it failed to keep pace with other powers in Europe, and in 1855, the sound dues due to pressure from the Americans and other European powers was abolished, putting a massive hole in the Danish economy. Even worse, the Danish military had failed to build up the required military or even civilian infrastructure to defend Schleswig-Holstein. In 1864, a combined Prussian and Austrian force invaded into Denmark, due to Denmark absorbing the duchies into its territory fully. After a month, German troops began marching into Denmark proper, and by war's end, they had almost reached the northern tip of Jutland. The war ended with all of Schleswig-Holstein, including even several Danish majority areas, ceded. Denmark lost 1/3 of its territory and 40% of its population in the war, and crushed the national psyche of the country. Danes feared this latest loss was a part of a wider process that had begun with the loss of Scania that would result in the abolition of Denmark, and Denmark increasingly began turning inward. Denmark would also, in the 1800s, lose many of its overseas colonies. The conflict with Britain in the Napoleonic Wars proved especially damaging for Danish merchants and its overseas colonies, which became overly expensive and a drain, especially after the abolition of slavery in Denmark in 1848. The Danish Gold Coast and India were both sold off to Britain in the mid-1800s. The Danish West Indies continued for several more decades until 1917, when they were sold to the United States. Looking ahead, Iceland would declare independence in 1944, and while the Faroe Islands and Greenland remain a part of the Danish kingdom, they have seen increased autonomy, a sizable separatist movement on both islands, and it's likely we will see at least one of these territories break away at some point in the future. The important thing to note about the loss of Denmark's colonies is, it shows that in the age of imperialism, when European powers were taking up even more parts of the non-European world, Denmark lost its colonies because it was too weak and unable to compete with its more successful rivals. After 1864, even though there was an attempt to crack down on mass politics, the genie had come out of the bottle, and increasingly new political movements began forming. This saw in the church various ecclesiastical movements form. First, there was the Intermission, a conservative, pietist-leaning movement emphasizing spiritual renewal, Christian brotherhood, and was largely vertical and structured from the top down. Then there was the Third Direction, which emphasized tradition and church culture, serving as a somewhat middle ground between various factions. The Third Direction would particularly be a middle ground between the conservative Intermission and the rising Grundtvigianism. Grundtvigianism was named after N.F.S. Grundtvig, a Danish thinker and highly influential in Danish culture and political thought in the 19th century. Grundtvigianism, unlike the hierarchical Intermission, placed a heavy emphasis on the popular, and Grundtvig-leaning organizations tended to be more equal among its members. Grundtvig helped the creation of the folk high school movement, which taught the school of life, which helped create the way for impoverished youths to learn and help further secularize the country. Grundtvigianists were often politically sympathetic towards the Danish liberals and left, known as Venstre, and opposed to the Danish right, or Jorge. Venstre was made up of a combination of those Grundtvigianists and generally farmers and members of Denmark's growing middle class. Venstre, importantly, was a heterogeneous movement, but still making up a broad range of political views, with both right and left-leaning liberals a part of the party, and frequent infighting being a common feature of the party. The Danish right for many decades dominated the country's politics, but slowly they began to lose ground, and in 1901, Venstre would finally take the Prime Minister's office, bringing about the modern liberal Danish political system. The late 1800s saw massive changes to Denmark. As stated earlier, the sound dues were abolished, greatly diminishing the revenue of the Danish state. Further agrarian reform that continued to privatize land and increases in productivity led to a massive rise in rural unemployment, especially for younger people. Many of these young Danes either moved abroad, with 77,000 leaving Denmark in just the 1880s, or moved into the cities. Here, slowly industrialization began to take place, and an urban working class began to form. Here in the urban cities, living and working conditions were hard, the cost of living expensive, and wages low. Some elements of the church tried to aid the growing urban poor by mutual aid. These elements of the church also wanted to give aid to try and halt the rise of the growing socialist movement in the country. Starting in the 1870s, Danish socialists and Marxists began forming, with the most notable being an early iteration of the Social Democrats. These early socialists had many Christian tendencies, even arguing Jesus was a pathfinder to socialism, although also calling for a complete end to the relationship between the Danish church and state. The socialists, while initially much smaller than Venstre or Jorge, saw decent growth and in 1899 was able to flex its muscles by leading mass strikes, forcing the government to begin to establish a social market economy. By 1910, the Social Democrats had emerged as the leading left-wing force in the country, supplanting Venstre, who ironically became the leading right-wing force in the country. Venstre's right-wing term was firmly cemented in 1905 when the pacifist and more left-wing Radical Venstre Party, or the Danish Social Liberals, was formed as a breakoff of Venstre. Radical Venstre quickly became made up of a combination of urban intellectuals and the rural poor. Radical Venstre was both useful and harmful to the socialists. It ate into the Social Democrats' support base, preventing it from ever achieving an outright majority. This forced the socialists to enter into governments with Radical Venstre, which became a reliable ally to the socialists, but also forced them to become more reformist and shed much of its revolutionary identity. In 1924, the first Social Democrat prime minister would be elected. Agriculture continued to be an important part of the economy, but slowly new industries started to grow. Manufacturing started to grow along with new banking companies being established. Importantly, however, the majority of companies were smaller scale rather than massive multinational corporations. The dominance of smaller companies has since the 1900s been a staple of the Danish economy. Farming would also see the dominance of smaller groups, with land reform in 1919 seeing small-scale farmers given land. The 1910s and World War I would see increasing government investment and regulation, and a social market economy and welfare state began to emerge in full force. This led to the creation of the Danish model, seeing heavy taxes, a large public sector. Skipping ahead, by 1970, one-third of all Danes would be involved in the public sector, and low growth, but at the same time a low level of income inequality, strong social programs, and strong union protections. This model has been both praised and critiqued, but important for understanding Danish history, this model came about by agreement between various Danish parties, and in the first half of the 20th century at least, there was a strong push to continue to grow the government. In World War I, Denmark remained neutral, but it did see a brief period of militarism in order to fortify the country, and actually saw the country rewarded post-war. As a part of the post-war peace progress, Germany lost certain territories and was forced to hold a plebiscite in Schleswig to determine who should control the region. Central Schleswig voted to remain in Germany, but northern Schleswig voted to return to Denmark, being a reversal of the trend of Denmark losing more and more land over the centuries. The World War also saw women given the right to vote in 1915. It, in the post-war period, continued to remain neutral. The Great Depression brought about serious hardship, with some urban areas seeing as high as 40% unemployment. This did trigger a growth in new alternatives to the four major parties, Venstre and the Conservatives, the successor of Jorge, on the right, and the Social Liberals and Social Democrats on the left. On the left, there was the Communists, whose best result in the 30s saw just 2.4% of the vote. There also was the Justice Party, a bit of an esoteric party, initially founded, according to Lauston, by Christian socialists and followers of Henry George, an American economist. On the right, two parties emerged. The Farmers' Party, a right-wing agrarian party, who was allied with the other new right-wing force in the country, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Denmark. It was based on the German Nazi Party, and in 1939 was able to elect members to the Danish parliament, albeit with less than 2% of the vote. In April of 1940, German troops crossed into Denmark, taking the country in just 6 hours. Denmark was occupied by the Germans, but notably with an extremely high degree of autonomy when compared to just about every other country occupied by the Nazis. This was due to a combination of factors. The Danes were in the Nazi racial hierarchy considered Aryans, and unlike Germany's other backwards neighbors like the Slavic Poles, Denmark's government also proved willing to negotiate with the Germans, promising to ban the Danish communist and anti-German/anti-Nazi newspapers, promised to provide surplus agricultural goods to Germany, and allow German military units to be stationed in Denmark. In turn, Denmark's government was largely allowed to remain intact, with any meetings between the Danish and German governments being conducted through the foreign ministries of both countries, and Germany's repression towards Jews and other undesirables was kept mostly at bay. The Danish government, which had become a grand coalition of all major parties, did try to push back against certain German demands, and the king, Christian X, famously became a symbol of Danish resistance. When Hitler in 1942 sent Christian a telegram wishing him a happy birthday, the king responded curtly, quote, "Giving my best. Thanks, King Christian," starting a crisis between Denmark and Germany. The Germans had hoped an election in 1943 would result in the Danish National Socialists taking power, but instead the National Socialists and their allies in the Farmers' League won just a combined 3.4% of the vote. The poor showing of the Nazis' favored party, along with increasing tension between the Danish and German government, led to the Germans to declare martial law and disband the Danish government. This led to a rise of armed resistance groups against the Germans. Initially, most of these groups, especially pre-1943, were communist aligned, although after 1943, a variety of Danes politically joined resistance groups. Two of the most influential acts of the Danish resistance would be the Danish Navy scuttling the remainder of the Danish fleet to prevent it from falling into Nazi hands, and the evacuation of over 90% of Denmark's Jewish population before they were deported to German concentration camps. With the Nazi defeat in 1945, Denmark was liberated, and Denmark's constitutional monarchy was restored. Initially, Denmark had relatively few changes in the war's aftermath, with neutrality on the world stage, the continuing dominance of the four major parties, and slow post-war growth. However, Denmark slowly began to move closer to Britain, who had for several decades been an increasingly important trade partner. As Britain moved closer into the American orbit, and the Soviets temporarily occupied the island of Bornholm after World War II, Denmark became more closely aligned with the West and was a founding member of NATO in 1949. While it wouldn't immediately join the European Economic Community, the forerunner to the EU, it would, after a referendum in 1972, join the EU when it formed after two referendums. As I talked about earlier, the public sector continued to grow, and Danish women began to enter the workforce in earnest during the 60s. Politically, the 50s would see some political reforms, removing the upper house of Denmark's parliament, and the reorganization between Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. The first election after World War II saw the communists see a massive surge in support, getting 12.5% of the vote, beating out the establishment's social liberals. The communist support base was largely buoyed by the important role in resisting Nazi rule, but shortly afterwards, the party began seeing serious electoral setbacks and infighting. A reformist breakoff of the party would, in 1960, break off, forming the Green Left, an important progressive party serving as an ally to the Social Democrats. But starting in the 70s, a backlash began to emerge against the establishment parties. This backlash largely emerged as a result of economic downturn and a growing segment of Denmark growing increasingly upset with the heavy taxes the Danish state was leveling. The 1973 election would see the establishment party suffer serious electoral defeats, while new parties from the left, right, and center all emerged. One of the most notable of these new parties would be the Progress Party, sometimes referred to as the Tax Evasion Party, with hostility towards taxes and the Nordic model being a central focus of the party, and later being a strong advocate against immigration and the EU. The party won 15% of the vote in 1973, and while it would pretty quickly lose support, its brand of right-wing populism would inspire several Danish parties in the coming decades, most notably today the Denmark Democrats, and to a certain extent the Danish People's Party and Liberal Alliance. While Denmark's politics continue to see the Social Democrats and Venstre lead the left and right respectively, its allies and coalition partners have changed, and many of their allies will take on a more anti-establishment streak. The current ruling coalition, however, has been a coalition of the center. Mette Frederiksen of the Social Democrats was elected Prime Minister in 2019, with a coalition of other left-wing parties. However, in the 2022 election, Frederiksen after the election decided to form a grand coalition between the Social Democrats, their traditional rivals Venstre, along with the Moderates Party, a centrist breakoff of Venstre. While Frederiksen has continued to support policies designed around propping up the Danish welfare state, and has since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine been strongly supportive of NATO, she does differentiate from other social democratic politicians, particularly on immigration, being strongly opposed to increased immigration and reducing the number of refugees allowed into the country. How much of this stance is Frederiksen sincerely arguing that migrants fail to integrate and harm the Danish welfare state, and how much of this stance is Frederiksen trying to appear tough on immigration to appeal to more populist voters, is up for debate. Migration leads us to discuss social and economic trends Denmark has experienced going into the 21st century. Immigration into Denmark has increased significantly in the 21st century, with hundreds of thousands of migrants moving into the country from a variety of places, but mostly Eastern Europe and the Middle East, largely being drawn to Denmark's relatively strong economy, good welfare system, and stable political system. There has been significant tension regarding the integration, or perceived integration, of these migrants, particularly Muslim migrants, as evidenced by the growth of parties basing themselves on hostility towards increased immigration, and a 2015 shooting carried out by an ISIS-inspired Danish Muslim against an artist who had drawn the Prophet of Muhammad. While Islam has seen growth in the country, the larger religious trend is increasingly secularization as more people are quietly leaving the Danish church. The Danish economy has seen agriculture continue to shrink, and since 2000, less than 8% of the country is employed in the agricultural sector. Increasingly high-tech manufacturing has played an important role in the Danish economy. Notably, the Lego company also was founded and is currently based in Denmark, originally coming from a family actually basing themselves around the intermission of Denmark. It currently is the largest toy manufacturer in the world and serves as an important cultural export from the country. Finally, the Danish monarchy, which has existed since the 900s, continues to, although Danish monarchs are largely ceremonial. In 2024, after his mother, the first woman sovereign in over 600 years, stepped down, Frederik X assumed the throne. Frederik, besides being king, also technically heads the Danish church, although reforms in the church dating to the 1800s has seen parliament, bishops, organizations like the Intermission, and lay people increasingly play an important role in guiding the church, which has seemingly taken on a more decentralized nature. So why does Denmark exist? The Kingdom of Denmark has existed in one form or another for over 1,000 years. Its position of holding the passage between the Baltic Sea and the Atlantic Ocean gave it a key geopolitical location, which made the kingdom very rich and powerful for many centuries. While the 1700s and 1800s saw serious losses in territory, and even the possibility for the disillusionment of the state, it managed to survive. Denmark is no longer a major heavyweight in European politics, but it is an important country in the EU and Northern Europe, and looks unlikely to dissolve anytime soon. So up next we go south to Djibouti, prepare for various African kingdoms, the Russians for a brief period, the French, a good geopolitical location, and probably at least one unfunny booty joke. Sorry, it's a kind of requirement if you're talking about Djibouti. But thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Up next, I will talk about Hungarian political parties. I think one of the parties may actually help me out in writing in their segment for the episode, but we'll have to see. Then I will do Thai political parties. I also think a Thai listener is going to reach out and help me write that. They left a YouTube comment a little bit ago, so if you are that listener and you want to help me out, please get in contact with me. I would love to learn more about Thai parties. And then after that, I will do the history of Djibouti. Yeah, going into the winter months, hopefully the Hungarian and Thai parties will be out relatively soon, at the very least, out before Christmas. And yeah, thanks for listening, thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountries.exist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I used for this episode are Geography Now's video on Denmark, the History of Scandinavia podcast, History Times video, Viking Age Capital of Denmark, Knud J.V. Jesperson's book, A History of Denmark, Martin Schwarz Lauston's book, A Church History of Denmark, Real Times history video on the Schleswig Wars, and finally, Wikipedia.